Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters and friends. And we're continuing with the argument from prophethood. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was he a liar? Was he deluded? Was he both lying or deluded? Or was he speaking the truth? And what we spoke about, brothers and sisters and friends, is that he couldn't be lying, he couldn't be deluded, he couldn't be both. He must have been speaking the truth. Then we spoke about the counter arguments to this. And the counter arguments include that it's all legendary. The historical facts that you assume to be truthful to base the fact that he's not lying, they're false. It's based on legend. So how can you trust them? And they argue in the following way: that there is bias, there are no early records of hadith, the existence of fabricated hadith shows you can't trust the whole enterprise, that the science of hadith is not robust, and that testimony is not a valid source of knowledge because the whole hadith is based upon the fact that you trust the say-so of others. And now is the time for us to deal with these counter arguments. Let's stick with the first one: bias. They say it's all biased because you only trust Muslim narrators. And obviously they're not going to say nothing bad about the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Obviously they're going to be biased with this man. But this is quite interesting because when it comes to the philosophy of history, when you claim bias, the onus of proof is the one who's claiming bias. So when you look at the prophetic traditions, you look at that hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the narratives around his life, how can anyone claim bias? Because some ahadith, some traditions go against the cultural norms of the time. They go against the very Arab culture, the very pride, egocentric Arab culture. For example, there is a prophetic tradition that says that the Prophet ﷺ fell off his riding beast. That's it. I mean, Arab culture used to respect their leaders and love their leaders and would never say anything bad about them. But there's a hadith that basically says he fell off his riding beast. I mean, they were so specific and scrupulous concerning every aspect of his life that they would even mention things that went against the cultural norms of the time. So how can you claim bias? Also, we have prophetic traditions by the Prophet ﷺ and many other people concerning certain aspects and certain kind of dialogues and interaction with women that went against the cultural norms of the time. For example, women used to show the Prophet ﷺ their sanitary towels. And they'll show it to him. Am I still on my menses? I mean, who did that at the time in Arabian culture? It shows it went directly against the cultural norms of Arabian society. So how can you claim bias? It doesn't make sense. Actually, this is evidence to claim they were speaking the truth because they were still willing to say the truth regardless of the social norm, regardless of the Arabian cultural context. So the bias theory is out of the window. The next point, brothers and sisters and friends, is that they claim there are no early records of hadith. This is not true. This is simply not true. We have various compilations. For instance, we have a compilation by Abdullah ibn Amr al-As during the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And his treatise is composed of around 1,000 prophetic traditions, and it remains secure and preserved. We also have another compilation by Humam ibn Munabbih. He was from the famous students of Abu Hurairah radiallahu an, and he wrote all of the prophetic traditions from his teacher. And copies of this are available from the libraries in Berlin and Damascus. And you can find more about this in M. Azami's Studies in Early Hadith Literature, published in 2001 by American Trust Publications. So you can't claim such a thing. But by the way, even if there wasn't physical copies of hadith, it doesn't really affect the preservation of hadith because hadith is an oral tradition, which we're going to discuss a bit later. But the point is, we do have early physical manuscripts concerning hadith. And you can go to Damascus and Berlin and find them yourself, inshallah. The next point, which I think is a bit of a funny point, to be honest, a bit humorous, is that, well, you have fabricated hadith. You know there is fabricated hadith. You have this so-called science that has some criteria for the chain of narration, the criteria for the matan, which is the text itself, and you claim whether something is fabricated or not, whether it's sahih, hasan, da'if, etc. And you have fabricated hadith, but since there are fabricated hadith, you can't trust any of the hadith. Well, this is ridiculous. It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because the very existence, brothers and sisters of friends, of fabricated hadith clearly shows that the science of hadith is working. If all the hadith that were presented were all true, then you should be suspicious. Then you should be like, hold on a second, but how do you know they're true? Maybe some are false. But the very fact that we have a science that filters through all of the prophetic traditions and narrations, and it could filter between the strong, the medium, and the weak, and the fabricated, actually shows that the science of hadith is working. So this contention, brothers and sisters and friends, actually supports our narrative. And that's the irony of the whole thing. Again, there's another contention, part of this whole legendary kind of theory, is that the science of hadith is not robust. And the reason they say this is because there's a split between Western academics. Some people trust it, some people don't. But frankly, this is not really much of a contention. This is based on, the say-so of others in terms of their own authority, in terms of you're arguing from authority. But let's look at the science of hadith and whether it's valid or not, rather than just relying on what other people say. But even in saying this, there are many Western scholars now that used to hold views that the prophetic traditions were not accurate and they're biased, and now they're slowly coming to realize that we can't reject this at all. For example, you have Harold Motsky in the Musannaf of Abd should I say that again? The Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq, in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1991, he said the following. He said, while studying the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq, there you go, I came to the conclusion that the theory championed by Goldziah, Schacht, and in their footsteps many others, myself included, which in general reject hadith literature as a historically reliable sources for the first century after Hijrah, deprives the historical study of early Islam of an important and useful type of source. And there are many, many other academics now that are starting to realize that the hadith are robust, because they're starting to study the classical sources and they're starting to study the robustness of the criterion for the isnad, the chain of narration, and the criteria for the matan, the text itself. And that's what I want to talk about now, to show how robust the hadith are. Because we have a whole array of criteria to assess whether people are trustworthy in the chain of narration of a hadith. And we have a whole array of criteria to assess whether the text itself is sound or not. This is called isnad criticism, the chain criticism, and matan criticism, the textual criticism. And let me just talk about some of the criteria, and it's not exhaustive, there's so many others, but let me just talk about some of them just to make you realize that to reject this is like rejecting any known history. So let's talk about some criteria for the isnad, the chain of narration. Well, here are some of the criteria used to assess whether someone was trustworthy or not, to actually take their say-so concerning the Prophet ﷺ, or the say-so of the oral tradition of their scholars that said that the Prophet ﷺ said something or did something. Number one, they took into consideration the name, nickname, title, parentage, and occupation of the narrator, that it should be known. The original narrator should have stated that he heard the hadith directly from the Prophet. If a narrator referred the hadith to another narrator, the two should have lived in the same period and have had the possibility of meeting each other. At the same time of hearing and transmitting the hadith, the narrator should have been physically and mentally capable of understanding and remembering it. The narrator should have been known as a pious and virtuous person. The narrator should not have been accused of having lied, given false evidence, or committed a crime. The narrator should have not spoken against other reliable people. And there's so many more criteria. Now let's talk about the criteria for the matan, the text itself. The text should have been stated in a plain, simple language, as this was the undisputed manner of the speech of the Prophet ﷺ, A text which referred to actions that should have been commonly known and practiced by others but were not known and practiced was rejected. A text contrary to the basic teachings of the Quran was rejected. A text contrary to another established prophetic tradition was rejected. A text inconsistent with historical facts was rejected. A text by an obscure narrator which was not known during the age of the Prophet Prophet's companions or the subsequent generation was rejected. And it goes on and on and on. The reason I'm mentioning some of these criteria is to show, look, this is such a robust system. Not even Western historians use these criteria for the existence of Aristotle or Plato or any other known history. So to reject our history is like rejecting any known history. So finally we come to the point now, which is the basis for hadith, is testimony. Can we trust the say-so of others? Is it a valid source of knowledge? And this is the basis for the hadith. But of course we can. And this is very interesting because this concerns the epistemology of testimony. And what is the epistemology of testimony? The epistemology of testimony is actually trusting the say-so of others. Knowledge gained from the say-so of other people. And it's very interesting, brothers and sisters and friends, that in the 90s, there was a publication by Professor C.A. Cody, which was called Testimony, a Philosophical Discussion, published by Oxford. And that was like a milestone publication to reinvigorate and revive the kind of authority of testimony that is a valid source of knowledge. Because if you think about it, brothers and sisters and friends, many of our beliefs is based on the say-so of others. Take, for example, the existence of China. How do you know China exists? Don't even say Google Maps, because you have to believe that someone said that this is China. You didn't take it yourself. You didn't go to China yourself. Don't say you've spoken to a Chinese person, because I could say to you, hello, I'm Pakistani, because I look Pakistani, but I'm not, I'm Greek. Anyone can claim something. You may say, well, I've seen the map of the world. Well, again, that's testimonial. It's the say-so of others. You may say, I've gone to a Chinese restaurant, but you haven't gone to a Chinese restaurant in China. The point is, you haven't directly, empirically, physically assessed China yourself. It's all testimonial. So testimony is a valid source of knowledge. And that's why you have the likes of Assistant Professor Benjamin McMyler, you have Professor Keith Lehrer, you have Professor Lackey, Professor Elizabeth Fricker, and others. They're saying that testimony is a valid source of knowledge. But there are some criteria for testimonial knowledge. And this is why in the next episode, I really want to highlight how important testimony is and what criteria we use to assess if testimony is true or not, or whether we should trust testimony and how we could trust the testimonial transmission of knowledge from other people.